She lived for 13 years without ever knowing what sunlight felt like, without ever feeling affection, without even knowing what a word was. Locked up, tied down, silenced. In that house in Monterey Park, no one had a clue what was hiding behind the closed curtains, until one day, the silence screamed. Genie Wiley wasn't born a mystery. She was turned into one by her own father. And what investigators found inside that house changed the way we understand the human mind forever. You're about to hear one of the saddest and most disturbing stories ever documented in modern history. Welcome to Urban Hauntings, where we dive deep into mysteries, paranormal cases, and true crime stories with a gripping, thoughtful approach. If you're into this kind of content, support the channel. Like, comment your theories, share with friends who love the supernatural and true crime, and subscribe with notifications on. Your support helps us grow and makes a real difference. Now, let's get into today's story. On the outskirts of Arcadia, California, a little girl was born who should never have been forgotten. Her real name remains hidden, but the world came to know her as Genie, a cruel reference to the mythical figure who set free from the lamp too late. The last of 4 children, second to survive, born into a marriage poisoned by trauma, isolation, and inherited rage. Genie never had a childhood. She was raised in darkness, fed on silence, punished just for existing. From the first few months of life, Genie was seen as a burden by her father. A hip condition forced her to wear a brace until almost age 1, delaying her ability to walk. To Clark Wiley, this was proof she was mentally disabled. The verdict was made. He banned everyone in the house from speaking to her. No words, no interaction, just the sound of her breathing, and sometimes muffled cries swallowed by fear. At just 20 months old, tragedy struck. Her paternal grandmother was hit and killed by a car. Clark spiraled into madness. He became convinced the world was his enemy, and the only way to protect his family was to hide them from it. But what he really did was bury his daughter alive, still breathing, still watching, still terrified. Genie was strapped to a child's potty chair for 13 hours a day, wearing only a diaper, her movements restrained by a harness her own mother had sewn, under constant threat. At night, she was locked inside a crib with a metal screen lid, motionless, silent, alone. The only items in her room, 2 raincoats hanging from hooks, a few plastic containers, and torn-up magazines. The window, almost completely covered, just a sliver of sky visible, a cruel reminder that the world outside kept turning. Without her, if she made any sound at all, her father would growl outside the door like a dog. Then the beating would come. It always came. By age 13, Genie weighed just 59 pounds. She couldn't speak. She couldn't chew food. She couldn't walk upright. Her eyes couldn't focus beyond 10 feet, the exact length of the room she'd been imprisoned in. Her mother, nearly blind, was submissive, paralyzed by terror and numbness. Her brother, forced to participate in the abuse, had already run away. But Genie, she stayed, frozen in time, buried alive in a house where no one heard her screams, because she had forgotten how to scream. Before becoming a father, Clark Wiley already carried demons from his childhood. Raised in orphanages in the Pacific Northwest, he lost his father to a lightning strike when he was still a boy. His mother, who ran a brothel, gave him a girl's name and saw him only rarely. Mocked and isolated, he grew up feeding on hatred. Hatred toward his mother, hatred toward his past, and, over time, hatred toward the very idea of being a parent. Genie never stood a chance. She was born from the obsession of a broken man, and she paid the price. During World War II, Clark worked as a flight mechanic. Quiet, obsessive, craving control and intolerant of noise. He married a woman 20 years younger from a small town in Oklahoma. At first, things seemed fine, but soon the isolation began. He forbade her from leaving the house. He beat her frequently. Their first children died under tragic and suspicious circumstances, one from choking, another from pneumonia. Then came Genie. When Genie turned 18 months, her grandmother was killed in the car accident. The emotional shock broke something inside Clark. He blamed his own son for the death, since the boy had been walking with her at the time. What followed was a complete descent into paranoia and delusion. Clark decided the world had betrayed him. He decided no one else would ever reach his daughter. Not time, not language, not light. He turned Genie's room into a prison. No conversations, no laughter, no sound at all. He beat her with a wooden plank anytime he heard noise. To control her, he created a twisted routine. He grew his fingernails like claws, growled like a dog, scratched doors to terrify her. He built a world of domestic horror where fear was the only form of communication, a language with no words. In his warped mind, Clark believed Genie was mentally impaired. He thought isolating her would protect her from a cruel world. But in truth, he was molding her to match his madness. He acted like a jailer, always keeping a rifle nearby, and recorded her captivity in disturbing detail, like it was a mission. No one came in, no one left. And every day, Genie lost a little more of herself. Another day without language. Another day without being a child. It happened by chance, a wrong turn, the wrong room. On November 4th, 1970, a nearly blind woman walked into the wrong place and changed history. She was looking for help with her vision problems. But beside her, holding her hand, was a girl, thin, pale, eyes lost, body tense like a trapped animal. She was 13 but looked like she was 6. The social worker paused. Something wasn't right. And in that moment, the silence of 13 years began to scream. The mother, confused and disoriented, tried to explain. She said her daughter was mentally retarded, that she couldn't speak. But the worker didn't buy it. There was fear in the girl's eyes, a deep, old fear. A supervisor was called, then the police. Once they confirmed the girl's identity, the legal system kicked into gear. That same day, Genie's parents were arrested. Genie was taken to the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, and for the first time in her life, she saw a world beyond that dark, locked room. The doctors were stunned. Genie weighed just 60 pounds. She wore diapers. She had 2 nearly full sets of teeth, a side effect of delayed development. She walked hunched over with her arms bent forward, in a gait they would come to call the bunny walk. Her joints were stiff, her muscles atrophied. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She had been molded into absolute silence. Her body told a story. That word still couldn't. As the media began sharing the photo of the wild child of Los Angeles, Genie's father, Clark Wiley, stayed silent. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he wrote 2 letters. One to his son, "Be a good boy. I love you." And one to the police. "The world will never understand." The next day, before appearing in court, he took his own life with a gunshot, in the same house where he'd enforced silence for years. Only the echo remained, and the pieces of a horror that was finally being uncovered. Genie was officially made a ward of the state of California, but the justice system wasn't sure what to do with her. She wasn't just a victim, she was a mystery, something between human and unknown. Doctors, psychologists, linguists, they all wanted to study her, but few seemed truly prepared to understand her. The question wasn't just what had happened to Genie, it was, what was left of her? She was examined by James Kent, a young physician at the Children's Hospital. What he found wasn't just a broken body, it was a broken soul, pale, expressionless, uncoordinated. Her abdomen was swollen, her hips deformed. Tests revealed that her bones were the age of an 11-year-old. Though she was 13, Genie was trapped in a body that had stopped growing, just like her mind. And still, there was something there, a flicker, a presence, a silent cry for help. She didn't speak. She only responded to gestures. She couldn't recognize emotions. She couldn't hold objects firmly. She had never played, never hugged, never run. Her hands shook. Her gaze was distant. She drooled constantly, rubbed her nose on her clothes, and chewed with her fingers, as if she were still learning to be human. Kent concluded he had never seen abuse this severe. Genie was a survivor of a domestic battlefield, a trauma that was physical, neurological, and psychological, all at once. Her body revealed more truth than any report. Scars on her buttocks told of years in restraints. Her weak muscles screamed of a life without movement. Her eyes could only focus up to 10 feet, the exact size of the room she'd been imprisoned in. The muscle memory of that prison still lived in her. Every small, hesitant movement proved she had spent years learning that moving meant danger. They tried cognitive tests, but how do you test someone who had never been stimulated? In some areas, Genie scored like a 1-year-old. In others, like a 3-year-old. She didn't understand ownership, time, or hierarchy. If she saw something she wanted, she took it. If she got frustrated, she hurt herself. She had been beaten as a child. Now she beat herself. It was a psychological echo. a closed cycle of internalized violence. But even in the rubble, signs of life began to appear. She was fascinated by new sounds. She touched objects with curiosity. She approached strangers without fear. She didn't cry, but she watched. She didn't speak, but she listened. Kent saw a spark, a possibility. Even after years buried in silence, Genie was still alive inside, and the scientific world was about to try to decode her. The news spread like wildfire. Wild child found in Los Angeles. Within days, the hospital hallways were flooded with voices. Linguists, psychologists, neurologists. Everyone wanted to see the girl who had lived 13 years in total silence. But Genie wasn't an experiment. She was a shattered child. Still, the scientific community saw her as a miracle and an opportunity. After all, no one had ever emerged from such extreme isolation at such an advanced age. The question was clear. Could she still learn to speak? For researchers, Genie was the ultimate test case, proof or disproof of decades of theory. Noam Chomsky argued that language is innate to humans. Eric Lenneberg proposed the idea of a critical period, a biological window for language acquisition that closes after puberty. Genie, at 13 and a half, had passed that limit. So what now? Would she unlock the mysteries of human language? Or would she become the cruel proof that, without words, we're just shadows? In her first month at the hospital, she showed something remarkable. Even though she didn't understand sentences, she recognized faces, places, and objects with nearly photographic memory. Tests on her brain's right hemisphere showed extremely high perceptual abilities. Genie identified numbers, shapes, and patterns with impressive speed. But when it came to language, everything froze. Sounds became noise. Words had no meaning. It was as if there was an invisible wall between the world and her mind. She learned to express herself through gestures. She created her own codes, pointed with purpose, acted out ideas with her body. But to the linguists, that wasn't enough. They needed to know if she could master grammar, conjugate verbs, form sentences. They needed answers. So they began testing her, over and over, day after day, and the line between helping and exploiting began to blur. Every breakthrough became data, every silence a research field, and the danger grew that the scientific world would forget that Genie was a person. In the background, a question lingered. Was she always like this, or was she shaped by pain? Some claimed Genie had been intellectually disabled from birth. Others, like linguist Susan Curtis, fiercely disagreed. She believed it was all caused by isolation. Curtis saw intelligence, potential, a hunger for life. And that made Genie not just a case study, but a living victim of neglect, abuse, and a broken system. The experiment had begun, but the most important question still echoed. Who would truly take care of Genie? At first, Genie could only say 2 sentences. Short, heavy, stop it, and no more. They weren't for communication. They were shields, defense mechanisms, not language. But slowly, something began to shift. Her eyes started to search for faces. Her body didn't recoil as often, and with the help of therapists and linguists, she began to learn, very slowly. First, names of objects, then colors, simple actions. Words started to appear, like lightning bolts in the middle of a storm, brief, powerful, and often lonely. Her progress was uneven. While her vocabulary expanded, her grasp of grammar stalled. Genie could say ball or hospital, but she couldn't form a sentence like, the ball is at the hospital. Words existed in her mind, but they didn't connect, like puzzle pieces from different boxes that never fit. Linguists were stunned by the phenomenon. It was as if her brain could understand concepts, but the structure of language had been damaged beyond repair. The person who got closest to Genie was Susan Curtis. She realized that Genie not only understood emotions, she knew how to use them. Through gestures, facial expressions, and silence, Genie grabbed people's attention. She triggered empathy. Sometimes complete strangers would hand her gifts in the street. Curtis started calling her the Great Abbreviator, because Genie said as little as possible, and still made herself understood. Was it a survival instinct, or a glimpse of hidden genius buried under years of neglect? But there were still hard limits. Genie confused I and you. She'd say, "Mama, love you," while pointing to herself. She struggled to tell what was hers and what belonged to others. Time, hierarchy, identity, all blurry. It was as if the isolation had fractured her sense of self. Without social mirrors, she never learned who she was. And without that foundation, mastering language, which depends on context, relationships, subjectivity, became nearly impossible. The scientific world was divided. Some insisted Genie was living proof of the critical period theory. She'd missed the window for learning language, and it was now forever closed. Others, like Curtis, believed otherwise. They saw potential. They saw that every new word she spoke was a miracle. But time didn't stop. And while debates heated up in academic halls, Genie kept growing. Alone. Surrounded by voices that studied her, but rarely listened. Genie's past was a locked box with no key. But slowly, cracks began to show. In quiet moments, she would murmur broken sentences. Father hit stick. Genie cry. The grammar was fractured, but the pain was clear. They were memories. Each one sounded like a whisper rising from the bottom of a deep well. Genie couldn't explain what she felt, but her body did. She trembled. She closed her eyes, and the room would fill with an invisible presence, the ghost of Clark Wiley. These flashbacks always came with disturbing behavior. Genie would have sudden outbursts. She hurt herself, bit herself, scratched, slammed her head. Sometimes she refused to eat, as if she were waiting for permission. Other times she hoarded jars, liquids, and tiny objects, as if clinging to remnants of a childhood where whatever little she had needed to be hidden, protected like treasure. Each action was a living scar, each silence, an unspoken memory. Gradually, researchers started to understand her fear of animals, especially dogs and cats. It wasn't dislike, it was panic. Everything clicked when her mother revealed the truth. Clark used to growl outside her door. He'd grow his fingernails to scratch the walls. He'd imitate dogs just to terrorize her. Genie had been conditioned to associate animal sounds with pain, with punishment, with pure terror. It wasn't animals she feared. It was the monster, and the monster was human. One day, she saw a picture of a wolf in a magazine, and she froze. Her body started shaking, her eyes locked. A silent scream began to rise from inside her. It was trauma speaking, the visual memory of a father who acted like a predator, stalking his prey day after day for 13 long years. The researchers realized, even without words, Genie could tell her story. All you had to do was watch, feel, and respect the silence. With each memory that surfaced, the world faced a painful question. How much can a child be destroyed before she stops being a child? Genie never had toys, or lullabies, or warm hugs. She had ropes, and screams, and the sound of a growl. And yet, in those timid gestures, in those scattered bits of speech, there was a seed of resistance. Because even after everything, she remembered. And to remember was, in a way, to survive. After her first few months in the hospital, Genie seemed to blossom. She was learning new words, exploring her surroundings, and building fragile bonds with patient adults. But with progress came conflict. Who should be responsible for her? The doctors? The linguists? The state? Or someone from the outside? The first to step forward was Jean Butler, a public school teacher and Genie's temporary guardian. She took Genie into her home under the excuse of a possible rubella exposure. It was supposed to be temporary, but it quickly turned into a silent battle for control. Jean saw more than a student in Genie. She saw a mission. In her diary, she compared herself to Anne Sullivan, the famous teacher who helped Helen Keller. Genie, she believed, was her chance to make a lasting mark. But soon, troubling signs appeared. Butler began limiting visits from researchers. She blocked testing. She claimed the scientists were exploiting the girl, but to the scientists it looked like something else entirely. That Butler was isolating Genie once again, cutting her off from everything, including essential care. The atmosphere became suffocating. Signs of regression began to show. That's when David and Marilyn Rigler stepped in. He was the chief psychologist at the hospital. She was a social worker with experience in child development. They agreed to take Genie in, temporarily. But temporary turned into nearly 4 years. During that time, Genie lived in a home filled with routine, interaction, and stimulation. She had her own room, regular meals, even basic chores. For the first time, she experienced something close to normal life, though always under the watchful eye of science. But that duality only grew stronger. The Riglers were caregivers and researchers. David led the psychological tests. Marilyn managed the daily care. Susan Curtis still visited almost daily, building a deep emotional bond with Genie. But there was a problem. Everyone wanted to help, but everyone had their own method. Scientific interests began to outweigh emotional care. And once again, Genie found herself surrounded by adults making decisions for her, even the ones with the best intentions. The battle for her custody turned into an arena of egos. Jean Butler accused the Wrigglers of emotional abuse. The Wrigglers accused Butler of isolation. Curtis tried to maintain an emotional bond, and the state just stood by, unsure. Once again, Genie was at the center of a conflict she couldn't understand. While everyone argued over what was best for her, a single, quiet, uncomfortable question lingered in the air. What if no one really knew how to care for someone who had never learned how to live? In 1975, when Genie turned 18, the research funding dried up. The academic excitement had faded. The groundbreaking study that once promised to revolutionize our understanding of language had crumbled into paperwork, confusion, and clashing egos. The girl who had once been so closely observed now felt like an institutional burden. David and Marilyn Wriggler, who had taken her in for nearly 4 years, decided to end the arrangement. Their reason was simple. Their time was up. But for Genie, the abandonment was just beginning. Her mother, now partially recovered in vision, requested custody. The authorities agreed. And just like that, Genie was pulled away from what little stability she had managed to build. She returned to her childhood home. Same neighborhood, same streets, same silence, louder than the traffic. But the scars she carried didn't fit this new routine. Without constant supervision, Genie withdrew again. She cried often, reacted poorly to instructions. Her mother, emotionally unstable, couldn't handle it. Within months, Genie was handed back to the state. What followed was a vicious cycle of abandonment and suffering. Foster home after foster home, institution after institution. In one of them, she endured serious physical and emotional abuse. She was beaten for vomiting, threatened with never seeing her mother again if she misbehaved. Her response was regression, fear, starvation. She stopped speaking, stopped connecting. All the progress she had fought so hard to achieve was lost. Genie returned to square one, but this time there were no scientists trying to save her. Curtis, the linguist who had believed in her the most, was the only one who tried. She visited Genie, noticed the decline, filed reports, but the state was slow, and by the time they responded, it was too late. With every new placement, Genie deteriorated. She refused to eat, rejected human contact, even sign language. Once her bridge to the world began to fade, what was once a scientific case had become a tragedy of government neglect. Genie was slipping away, not because she lacked potential, but because she lacked care. Meanwhile, the scientific community moved on. Genie's case no longer made headlines. The press stopped asking questions. The universities shifted focus. The world forgot. And the girl once called a linguistic miracle now lived in silence. In adult care facilities run by the state, her voice, once fragile and full of hope, went quiet for good. And with it, the promises of rehabilitation faded too. What remained was silence. An old silence, familiar and terrifying. After countless homes, countless losses, and countless failed fresh starts, Genie disappeared from public view. The state of California assumed guardianship, and she was moved to a care facility, its location never revealed. The girl who, for a fleeting moment, had the world's eyes on her, now lived behind anonymous walls. No journalists, no researchers, no updates. Genie had become invisible again. As if she had never left that dark room she escaped from back in 1970. Curtis tried to find her. She called, she wrote, she pleaded, but she was blocked. Genie's mother, now her legal guardian, cut all ties with researchers, all except for psychiatrist Jay Shirley. The reasons were never fully explained, but the message was clear. The scientists who once cared for Genie were now seen as intruders. And in that silence, Genie lost more than her tutors. She lost any chance at consistent therapeutic care. Once again, she was alone. Time passed. Her mother died in 2003. Her brother, who had only seen her once since 1982, passed away in 2011. And Genie? She remained off the record. In 2016, a report confirmed she was still alive, still under state custody, somewhere in Los Angeles. She lived in a modest care facility, received few visits, and still used signs to communicate. She spoke very little. She didn't smile. Her life had become a faint presence, an echo of the girl who once moved the world. And no one really knows what goes through Genie's mind today. No one knows how she sees the world, the sounds, the faces, the life around her. But one thing is certain. She is the living reminder of everything that can go wrong when the system fails, when science turns its back, when the state goes silent. Genie isn't just a case study. She's a dark mirror, a reflection of what happens when suffering is forgotten, when trauma is labeled, and then discarded. Genie's disappearance wasn't sudden. It was slow, gradual, one home at a time, one canceled visit at a time, one imposed silence at a time. And now, though still alive, she is just a shadow of the child she could have been. There is no closure, no full recovery, only an invisible presence, somewhere in California, still trying to understand a world that locked her away before she even had a name for it. Genie's case isn't just a personal tragedy. It is an open wound in the history of modern science. In the name of knowledge, linguists and psychologists tested her, observed her, analyzed her, but somewhere along the way, they forgot something essential. Genie wasn't an experiment. She was a little girl, a human being, shattered, and when the spotlight faded, she was left behind. The promise of healing turned into abandonment. What was once hope became institutionalized silence. The ethical debate surrounding this case is heavy, uncomfortable. Should scientists have also acted as her caretakers? Or did they cross a line they shouldn't have? Many argue that emotional involvement compromised objectivity. Others say the opposite, that cold, clinical detachment ignored her most basic human needs. Her name appeared in conferences, academic papers, books, and documentaries. But how many of those people were actually willing to stay with her until the end? Genie was studied, but never fully understood. From a scientific standpoint, her case shattered theories. She confirmed that language development really does have a deadline, the so-called critical period. Genie had missed it, and no matter how many words she learned, her mind never seemed able to build full grammatical structures. She understood the world through images, gestures, and sounds, but not through sentences. It was as if she had lost, forever, the key that unlocks the door to language. And with it, a part of her humanity was lost too. But Genie proved something else as well, the incredible plasticity of the human brain. Despite everything, she learned. She developed vocabulary. She responded to stimuli. She formed emotional bonds, fragile but real. Her visual and spatial abilities were extraordinary. Her right brain hemisphere, highly developed. Her nonverbal communication, almost hypnotic. Amid destruction, there was still resilience, a spark of strength that refused to die, even after years of psychological torture and systematic neglect. Today, her name is found in textbooks on linguistics, psychology, and medical ethics. But Genie isn't a reference, she's a muffled scream, a reminder that science, without compassion, can become as cruel as the abuse it claims to study. She forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Is it more important to prove a theory or to save a life? Genie Wiley never had a choice, but we do, by remembering, by reflecting, and by never again reducing a human being to a case file. Genie Wiley survived the unthinkable. 13 years locked in darkness, silenced by a father who mistook control for protection, and forgotten by a society that wavered between scientific fascination and institutional neglect. Her story doesn't have a happy ending, but it doesn't disappear either. Because as long as memory exists, Genie still exists. As a symbol, as a warning, as a question no one has answered. Because what hurts most about her story isn't just what was done to her, but what was left undone afterward. The promise of healing turned into abandonment, empathy turned into data, and Genie, who, for one brief moment, had the attention of the entire world, returned to loneliness. This time, not in a dark room, but in institutional silence. Science set out to learn if it was still possible to acquire language after childhood. But in the end, we discovered something even more disturbing. The absence of love can be just as destructive as the absence of words. Now, decades later, her image still haunts us. The empty eyes, the hunched walk, the hands held tightly in front of her body like shields. Genie was shaped by darkness, and still, she tried to grow, she tried to connect, She tried to make sense of a world that only studied her, but never really listened. Her entire life was a fight to say something, anything, and even when her sentences were short, broken, or wrong, every word was an act of existence. Maybe the most important question isn't, why did this happen? But rather, how many other genies are still out there, invisible, silent, locked in rooms we don't see, waiting for a hand, a voice, a glance. Genie forces us to look inward, to realize how loud silence can be, and how often we choose not to hear it. If this story moved you, share it. Talk about it, comment, spread it, because stories like Genie Wiley's must never be forgotten. And remember, not all silence is peace, not all lack of words is consent. Sometimes silence is the loudest scream of all.